My name is Isla Raymond. There are moments in life when you expect pain, when your body braces for it before it even begins. The day of my father's funeral was one of those moments. I woke up knowing it would hurt, not just because I'd lost the man who raised me, who once carried me on his shoulders through thunderstorms and made the world feel safer than it was, but because I'd have to face the people who had spent years reminding me that I didn't belong. Grief, I've come to learn, isn't just about death. Sometimes it's about what dies long before someone takes their last breath. The relationship I once had with my family had been on life support for years. It had been eroded by small comments, prolonged silences, and doors that were closed when they should have been left open. By the time I arrived at the chapel that morning, dressed in a black dress I'd worn to 3 previous funerals, the ache in my chest wasn't new, it was familiar. A bruise pressed daily until it felt like part of me. I sat toward the back, partly because it felt right and partly because I didn't have the strength to ask anyone to move. My stepmother had claimed the front row, flanked by her children and cousins who always made a show of familial unity. They were dressed immaculately, grief curated like a gallery, just enough sadness to be seen, but not enough to seem undone. I, on the other hand, looked like I'd barely made it. My shoes were scuffed, my coat was thrifted, and I clutched my worn purse like it held my composure inside. As people began to gather, offering soft condolences and shoulder touches, I noticed the glances, the not-so-subtle whispers behind manicured hands. My half-brother nudged his cousin and smirked in my direction, whispering something that made them both laugh under their breath. My stepmother didn't look at me directly, but I heard her. She always was the disappointment, she murmured, loud enough for the row behind her to hear, and I just sat there. I didn't flinch, I didn't cry, I didn't storm out the way they probably wanted me to. I just kept my hands folded and stared straight ahead at the altar, where a photo of my father sat surrounded by white roses. I remembered when that photo was taken. I had been there that day. They hadn't. It's strange, really. Funerals are supposed to be about remembrance, about honoring the person who's gone and comforting those who remain. But for me, it was a reminder of just how alone I had been, how long I had carried the weight of being the outlier, the one who didn't fit into their glossy narrative. My father had always been a complicated man, not perfect, but he saw me. That mattered. In his final year, when the disease took more from him than it gave, I was the one who showed up. I came when the calls got hard, when he couldn't remember how to work the TV remote or needed someone to help him bathe with dignity. It was thankless, sometimes wordless, but it was real. I didn't post about it, I didn't announce it at dinners, I just did it because he was mine, and I loved him. Even when he was hard to love, that day none of that mattered to the people around me. All they saw was the quiet girl with discount shoes and no real place at the table, the one who had always been too much of something or not enough of everything, the one who left the family group chat on purpose and never got added back. As the service began, I folded into myself, trying to find some warmth in a room that had none for me. The pastor spoke kindly, his voice echoing off marble walls that made even lies sound holy. My stepmother dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief, while her children looked on with practiced solemnity. I sat still, listening, remembering. When the ceremony ended, I slipped out through the side. I needed air, space, distance, but as I stood in the parking lot, arms wrapped around myself, I heard them behind me laughing, joking about how I'd probably try to ask for something from the estate, that I'd come sniffing around like a desperate stray. I didn't turn around. I didn't speak, because what they didn't know was that my father had already spoken for me. And soon, they would hear him too. I don't think there's anything lonelier than sitting in a room full of people who share your last name and still feeling like a stranger. That's what it was like after the service, everyone lingering at the church hall reception, balancing plates of finger food and glasses of cheap wine, exchanging stories that made them look generous, loyal, close. It was all performance. The same people who could barely look me in the eye were suddenly overcome with grief and devotion for a man they only visited on holidays. I stood by the coffee urn, pouring myself a lukewarm cup just to keep my hands busy. Around me, my father's second family had formed a tight circle near the window, the sunlight catching their designer accessories, their polished shoes, their smooth, practiced grief. My stepmother held court, seated gracefully like a matriarch, in mourning, with her hand resting dramatically on her chest as she recounted how hard it was to watch him slip away. I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing. she hadn't been there. Not at the end. Not when he couldn't remember her name and called out for me instead. My half-brother, Theo, stood beside her. Tall and smug in his tailored black suit. He never missed an opportunity to perform. As I passed by, heading to the bathroom, I caught the end of a sentence, something about my shoes. He chuckled and leaned toward his cousin with an exaggerated whisper. Did she dig those out of a bin, or is that just her aesthetic? Laughter followed, quick and mean. I paused, but didn't turn around. I could feel the heat rise up my neck, not from shame, but from something older, deeper, the kind of burn that comes from years of being made small. My purse, the one I clutched like it held my entire spine together, had been with me through job interviews, hospital visits, long nights at the hospice. It wasn't expensive, but it was mine. Like everything else in my life, I had earned it. I made it back to my seat without crying. That was my victory. I sat down and watched the others float around the room, hugging guests, telling carefully crafted stories that framed them as present and devoted. My stepmother repeated how he had fought until the end, even though she hadn't sat with him once during the worst of it. She'd left that to the hospice nurses and me. No one looked at me. No one asked how I was doing, as if my grief wasn't as valid. As if I hadn't held his hand in the dark, whispered stories into his ear when his mind was slipping away, cleaned up after him with trembling hands and a steady heart. They didn't know about the way he clung to my voice or how he'd asked me to play his favorite song one last time. They didn't want to know. To them, I was the outlier, the daughter from his first marriage, the one who never really fit into the pristine portrait they had painted of their perfect little family. I was always either too quiet or too distant or too emotional, depending on who was criticizing me. I stared down at my paper plate, the untouched slice of quiche growing cold. And let them have their moment, let them laugh, let them whisper, let them pretend, because I had something they didn't. My father's final days weren't a photo opportunity, they were real, and I was there. Not for a performance, not for an inheritance, but because he was my father, and I loved him, even when it broke my heart. As the murmurs grew louder, and the shadows of their snickers stretched across the room, I sat still. I didn't flinch. I didn't respond. Because what they didn't understand, what they would never expect, was that grief wasn't the only thing my father left behind. He had left something else. Something louder than all their whispers combined, and very soon, I would let it speak. He wasn't an easy man to care for, especially in the end. My father had always carried himself with a certain pride, the kind that made accepting help feel like failure. Watching him weaken was hard, not just because I loved him, but because I could see how much it pained him to let go of the image he'd spent his whole life constructing. There was a moment, about 2 months before he passed, when I found him trying to shave himself with trembling hands. Blood dotted his chin, and the sink was smeared with soap and frustration. I stood in the doorway quietly and asked if I could help. He didn't look at me, just said, "If you take away a man's ability to take care of himself, what's left?" I didn't have an answer. I just stepped in and ran warm water over a fresh towel. That's how most of those final days went. I didn't make grand gestures or post updates. I just showed up. I brought him books he never finished and soup he barely ate. I rubbed lotion into his dry hands and changed the sheets when he was too embarrassed to ask. I made lists, kept track of medications, fought insurance companies, and sat through long, aching silences where the only thing he seemed to need was someone in the room. I didn't do it because I wanted anything from him. I did it because I knew what it felt like to be left alone. And no matter what pain had passed between us, no matter how fractured our relationship had been after his remarriage or how long we'd gone without talking, he was still my father. I still remembered the man who built me a dollhouse with his bare hands and drove across state lines to pick me up from college when I couldn't stop crying. I held onto those pieces, even when they were buried under years of hurt. What hurt the most wasn't how he deteriorated, it was how the rest of the family stayed away. They sent flowers. They posted well-meaning quotes. They called the hospice nurses to check in and then moved on with their lives. My stepmother stopped visiting when his memory began to fail. My half-brother didn't want to remember him like that. The cousins, they showed up only once, made small talk, and left quickly, saying they had work, but I stayed, and my father noticed. There was one evening, not long before the end, when he gripped my hand tighter than usual. His voice was rough, like gravel, but his words were clear. they come for the ending. Isla, but you were here for the unraveling. I didn't cry then, I nodded, squeezed his hand. And let the silence settle between us like peace. They thought I was invisible because I didn't parade my grief. They thought I was small because I didn't ask for anything. But what they didn't realize is that I already had everything they claimed to cherish. I had the time, the truth, the real man behind the photographs and the stories. I had his trust. And even though he was slipping away day by day, I could feel something shift in him, something about the way he looked at me. How he started to ask my opinion about things he'd never asked before, his accounts, the business, the house by the lake. I told him not to worry. That I'd take care of things, of him. He nodded, but I could tell he was thinking, and he kept thinking right up until the end. Now, sitting in a room where people laughed behind my back and dismissed my grief like it was something cheap and borrowed. I held on to that, to those hours of quiet care, to the sound of his voice thanking me when he could barely form words, to the look in his eyes when he realized I hadn't left. They thought they'd pushed me aside. But my father saw who truly stayed, and in the end, it would be his voice that rewrote everything they thought they'd won. I didn't know it would be the last time we'd speak. I think if I had, I would have tried to hold on a little longer, said something more profound, more complete, but life doesn't give you that kind of clarity. It only hands you the moment. And you either show up for it or you don't. That night, I picked up the phone after the third ring. He never called that late, and something in me knew before I even answered it was important. His voice was thin, like it was traveling across too much space. Isla, he said, my name soft but steady. You awake? I told him I was. He didn't say much right away, just breathed, slow and heavy, like every word had to fight its way out of his chest. I waited. He never liked being rushed. Eventually, he said, I'm proud of you. You know, I don't remember breathing after that, not right away. I just sat on the edge of my bed with the phone pressed to my ear like a lifeline. You've always seen me, he said, not for what I gave you, not for what I failed at, just as I am. There was a long pause after that, and I thought he might have fallen asleep mid-sentence. But then he whispered something I still hear when the house gets quiet. You never asked me to be someone else. I didn't cry then. I wish I could say I did, but I didn't. I just told him thank you, because it was the only thing that felt right, and because I knew he didn't say things like that lightly. My father wasn't a man of easy emotion. He didn't pour out affection like water. His love was quiet, practical, often buried under to-do lists and bank statements. But in that call, there was no hiding. He was telling me everything I needed to hear, even if I didn't realize it until later. He hung up after that, no goodbyes, just a soft get some sleep, baby. And then the line went quiet. I stared at my phone for a long time afterward, fingers trembling just a little. I knew he was slipping. His voice had that weight to it, like he was already halfway gone, and I remember thinking, what was he trying to say that night? Was it just love, or was it something more? I didn't know then that he had already spoken to his lawyer, that just weeks before that call, he had quietly rewritten the document that would change everything. No grand declarations, no drama, just a few signatures that carried the truth of what he couldn't always say out loud. Looking back now, I understand it. That call wasn't just goodbye. It was a passing of something sacred, a trust, a truth, a knowing that despite all the noise surrounding our family, he saw me, the real me, not the girl they gossiped about, not the disappointment my stepmother liked to name in passing, not the poor one, not the one with the scuffed shoes. He saw the daughter who stayed, the one who didn't flinch when it got hard, the one who didn't need to be asked to show up. He gave me more in that one call than anyone else had offered in years. And it wasn't the last time his voice would break their silence. The office smelled like paper and polished wood, old money and ego, dressed up in mahogany and leather chairs. I arrived early, not because I was eager, but because I needed a moment to gather myself before they filled the room. It had been 3 weeks since the funeral. 3 long weeks of silence from everyone who had once felt bold enough to laugh at my shoes and mock my grief. I hadn't heard from Theo, not a single message from my stepmother, but I knew they would all show up today. There was too much at stake. They trickled in right on time, dressed like they'd come to brunch rather than a legal proceeding. My stepmother wore a black sheath dress and heels that cost more than my rent. Her hair was pinned perfectly, her grief long buried beneath foundation and concealer. Theo wore a navy suit, unbuttoned at the collar, trying hard to look casual and confident. His cousin trailed behind him, eyes scanning the room like he expected a camera crew. They didn't speak to me when they walked in. They barely acknowledged I existed, and maybe that was a gift, because I didn't want to waste energy pretending to care. I sat quietly in the corner, same as I had at the funeral. Clutching the same worn purse, the same quiet dignity. I saw the way Theo glanced at it again, the smirk tugging at the edge of his mouth like he hadn't learned anything. The lawyer entered. A tall woman with gray streaks in her dark hair and the kind of presence that made everyone straighten in their seats. She carried a folder thick, heavy, final. She sat at the head of the table, her eyes scanning us all before she began. I've been appointed to carry out the reading of Mr. Raymond's final will and testament, she said. Her voice was smooth but clipped professional. There is only one will. It was updated and signed 2 months before his passing. 2 months. The words sat in the air like fog. I saw the way my stepmother's expression shifted, tightening, calculating. Theo leaned forward, suddenly alert. The lawyer opened the folder. What followed was a quiet unraveling. She began with the formalities: my father's full name, the date of his passing, the location of his estate, then the itemizations, smaller bequests, paintings, books, the classic car to distant relatives or longtime friends. The tension in the room was growing. I could feel it humming beneath the surface. Then she said my name, full ownership of Raymond & Co., including all business shares, patents, and intellectual property, is hereby transferred to Isla Raymond. Silence. I heard my name again. The lake house property in Mason Pines is left in full to Isla Raymond, along with the accompanying land rights and family deed. Theo shifted in his seat. My stepmother's lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. And then again, all financial assets associated with the Raymond Family Trust shall be overseen and managed by Isla Raymond, with full authority granted in perpetuity. By the time my name was spoken a third time, the only sound in the room was paper shuffling and shallow breathing. I kept my eyes down, heart pounding, trying to absorb the weight of each word without showing it on my face. I hadn't expected this, not entirely. I knew my father saw me. I knew we'd grown closer in the end, but this was louder than anything he had ever said out loud. He had written me back into the story. They tried to erase me from. My stepmother cleared her throat. There must be a mistake, she said. Voice brittle. That can't be right. He never mentioned. The lawyer looked up, calm and unflinching. It's all legal, signed, witnessed, notarized. Your husband was very specific. My father had spoken, not with sentiment, not with a tearful speech or a handwritten letter, but with the one thing that left no room for interpretation. Paper, ink, a will. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't just someone they tolerated. I was someone they had to face. You could almost hear the breath catch in the room as the final page of the will was turned. The lawyer's fingers moved deliberately, as if she wanted to give everyone time to prepare, though we all knew the damage had already been done. I sat with my hands in my lap, nails digging softly into the soft curve of my palm, grounding myself. The rhythm of my own name spoken aloud was still settling into my bones. I had come expecting nothing, maybe a small gesture of acknowledgement, a letter, a keepsake, something private and quiet, like my relationship with him had often been. Instead, I was watching everything they believed they had a claim to being handed to me in pieces. The lake house, the family trust, the business they joked I could never run. Each sentence added another stone to the foundation of truth that none of them could now deny. My father had seen through the noise, and he had made a choice, a conscious, deliberate choice. The lawyer read his words directly, no interpretation needed, to Isla Raymond, for her unwavering presence in the final season of my life, for her honesty, her loyalty, and her care. She has proven time and again who she is, and I entrust her with what I have built. My stepmother's face was expressionless in the most telling way, to still, to calm, as if her features were holding back the scream building behind her teeth. I could see the twitch in her jaw, the way her fingers gripped the arms of her chair, like they could hold her together. Theo sat with a stunned expression that slowly twisted into something sharper, his cockiness giving way to indignation. He turned toward the lawyer. There has to be an older version, a real version. My dad wouldn't do this. His voice cracked on the last word, the edge of disbelief catching him by surprise. For a moment, he looked like a boy spoiled, confused, and suddenly afraid. The lawyer didn't flinch. Your father updated this will 2 months before his death. It was witnessed and verified by legal standards. He was of sound mind and body at the time. There is no contest here. His wishes were clear. The silence that followed was thick and choking. I looked down at the grain of the wooden table, remembering the call I'd had with my father, the way his voice had softened when he spoke to me that night. It wasn't just sentiment. He'd been saying goodbye and leaving instructions all at once. No one said my name. No one congratulated me. They didn't have to. Their silence was louder than applause. My stepmother finally spoke, her voice cold and sharp. You think you earned this? You think sitting beside a dying man for a few weeks makes you worthy of? I didn't raise my voice. I didn't blink. I met her gaze and said, I didn't do it to earn anything. I did it because I loved him. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't pity. It was truth. And that's what made it impossible to argue with. They sat there stunned, scrambling to absorb what had just happened, trying to claw back control of a story that no longer belonged to them. I watched them fold in on themselves, anger, confusion, humiliation bubbling just beneath the surface. And still, I remained still, because I didn't need to gloat. I didn't need to explain. My father had done that for me. In every line of that will, he had spoken louder than they ever did with their gossip and their cruelty. He had used his final breath in legal form to give me the place they never allowed me to claim. I walked into that room as the girl they mocked at a funeral. But I sat at that table as the woman he trusted with everything. There's a particular kind of quiet that follows a revelation, a silence so profound it doesn't just fill the room, it sinks into the walls, presses against your chest, and wraps itself around your ribs like a vice. That's what the room felt like once the will had been read. No one moved, no one spoke. The paper in the lawyer's hand was still fluttering slightly from where she turned the last page, but otherwise, everything had gone still. Theo sat slouched in his chair, disbelief carved across his face. His mouth opened once, then again, as if the words were stuck in the back of his throat and refused to form. He looked lost, like a man who had been walking toward a door he assumed would open for him only to find it had been locked from the inside by someone he thought didn't have a key. My stepmother, on the other hand, had gone pale, not red with rage, not flushed with embarrassment, just white. Her hand was frozen in midair near her necklace, fingers absently touching the pendant she wore like a badge of status. She hadn't said a word since I spoke, but I could feel the fury radiating off her, the kind that comes from not just losing, but from realizing she had never been as in control as she believed. The lawyer began organizing the documents, placing each page back into its folder with calm efficiency. You'll all receive official copies, she said quietly, but these decisions are final. And just like that, the meeting was over. No one rose immediately. They sat stunned, like passengers who had survived a crash but were too dazed to get up. I stood slowly, careful not to rush, letting the moment stretch. Not because I wanted to savor their discomfort, though part of me did, but because I needed to remind myself that I didn't owe them anything, not even my hurry. I slipped my purse strap over my shoulder and nodded once at the lawyer, who gave me a look I'll never forget, something between respect and quiet recognition. It was the first real acknowledgement I had received since walking into the room. I held onto it like a hand on my back. As I moved toward the door, Theo finally spoke. You knew, his voice was bitter, almost accusing. You knew this was coming. I turned to him, met his eyes without flinching. No, I didn't, and it was the truth. I hadn't known exactly what my father would do. I had hoped he'd remembered that he'd seen me, but I hadn't counted on it. I had braced myself for the same familiar pain I'd always felt when it came to my place in this family, a quiet erasure, dressed in politeness. But he hadn't erased me. He'd engraved me into every word. My stepmother looked away. Theo said nothing more. I walked out into the hallway, the light suddenly feeling warmer, softer. The coldness I'd carried on my shoulders since the funeral began to ease. Just slightly. The air didn't feel so heavy anymore. I could breathe. And for the first time in a long time, I realized I wasn't invisible. I had been chosen, deliberately, quietly, completely, not because I demanded it, not because I shouted, but because I stayed. That silence in the room, that aching, stunned silence, it wasn't emptiness. It was recognition. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of lukewarm tea and my father's will spread out in front of me. The legal language still felt surreal, like reading about someone else's life. The house by the lake, the business, the trust, it was all real. My name, printed in black ink over and over, felt like a spotlight after years of being told I was invisible. I stared at the clauses, the signatures, the finality of it all. And what struck me most wasn't the assets or the surprise, it was the clarity. My father had been so precise, so deliberate, every detail accounted for, no ambiguity, no wiggle room. This wasn't an impulsive act of emotion, it was careful, thoughtful, intentional. And that made everything they'd said about me feel even smaller. They had spent years painting me as the estranged daughter, the difficult one, the girl who couldn't hold a job worthy of the family name or wear shoes worth photographing. They smiled for cameras at birthdays and holidays, crowding round my father like they were his greatest joy. They posted old photos of him on social media the day he died, captioned with long, heartfelt tributes that made it seem like they had loved him so deeply. But I had been there when he stopped recognizing faces. I had been there when he couldn't keep food down, when he begged for sleep, when he cried from pain and frustration and confusion. None of them had seen that version of him. They had stayed close enough to inherit, but never close enough to help. The photos were always perfect. I remembered a Christmas card from 2 years ago, my father in a red sweater, arm around my stepmother, Theo and his fiancée standing beside them, all beaming like a magazine ad. I wasn't in that picture. I wasn't even invited that year. My father told me later, in a rare moment of guilt, that it had been easier that way. But easy isn't love. Easy doesn't show up at 2 a.m. when the pain meds wear off. Easy doesn't learn how to turn a bedridden man every 3 hours to avoid bed sores. Easy doesn't clean up after someone who no longer has control of their body and still offer a kind word afterward. Easy isn't what gets remembered. They believed they could curate their way into legacy, that presence in photographs would outweigh presence in the quiet, unglamorous hours. But my father had seen the truth. He had watched them fade when things got uncomfortable, and he had watched me stay. I didn't need those photos anymore. I didn't need proof of proximity. I had something better: his final decision, his trust, his acknowledgement. He gave me the one thing I had stopped expecting, validation. As I sipped my tea, the bitterness I'd carried with me for years began to loosen. I didn't need to defend myself to them. I didn't need to argue or point to hospital records or calendars of visits or bank receipts showing all the things I bought for him when no one else would. The will said it all, and whether they liked it or not, it was binding. It was the end of their performance, and the beginning of my own quiet chapter. The first time I saw the lake house after everything. I sat in the driveway for almost 20 minutes before I could bring myself to step out of the car. I hadn't been there in years, not since before the remarriage, before everything got complicated, before I became the ghost at the edge of every family photo. My stepmother had turned it into her personal retreat, a place for curated family weekends and summer brunches where I was always the forgotten invite, the afterthought. I still remembered how it felt, scrolling through pictures online, seeing her sitting on the dock with Theo, wine glass in hand, captioned family time. The caption always stung more than the exclusion, but now the house was mine, not just on paper, in truth, in title, in spirit. And the silence that greeted me as I stepped inside wasn't cold or hollow, it was peaceful. It still smelled faintly of cedar and lavender. The furniture was the same, though I could already see what would need to go. The photos on the walls would come down first. The ones where my father stood beside a family that never made room for me, I would keep some. The ones that felt honest, where his eyes were still bright and his smile reached them. But the rest, they weren't mine to carry. I wandered room to room slowly, fingers brushing against bookshelves, picture frames. The old piano in the corner. I found a dusty wool blanket, draped across the arm of the couch, the same one he used to nap under when I was little. I sat for a while in the chair beside it, remembering how we used to talk for hours on that porch, his voice low, his hands always moving as he spoke, before things got complicated. Before life did what it always does, splits people, shifts roles, and leaves daughters clinging to memories no one else saw. I didn't cry. I thought I would, but I didn't, because this moment, this house, this inheritance wasn't about sadness. It was about reclamation, about receiving what I'd never dared to believe would come. Not money, not property, not even legacy. Dignity. My father had given me that with his final act, a kind of restoration no apology could have offered. He couldn't undo the years I spent being cast aside. But he had made it clear, in the most unflinching terms, that I had mattered, that he saw me, that he knew who really showed up when it counted. The rest of the family could spin it however they wanted. They could pretend it was a misunderstanding, blame his illness, suggest I manipulated him somehow. Let them. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to chase their acceptance anymore. That game had ended the moment his signature hit the page. I poured a glass of water and sat on the deck overlooking the lake. The wind was soft, the water calm. I thought about all the versions of me they had tried to define over the years, the disappointment, the recluse, the charity case. None of those versions were real. They were projections, defenses, distractions. But this version, sitting in a house they once claimed as theirs, finally breathing without apology, she was real. She was enough, and she was home. A week after the reading, I received a small package in the mail. No return address, just my name written in my father's unmistakable handwriting, slanted, precise, the I always dotted with the faintest curl. For a second I thought maybe I'd imagined it, that grief had started playing tricks on me. But when I opened it, I found a single envelope inside, aged at the corners, sealed with wax. There was no ceremony in the way I opened it, no trembling hands, no dramatic tears. Just a quiet reverence, like unfolding something sacred. Inside was a short letter no longer than a page, no grand declarations or confessions. Just his voice, speaking to me in that steady, measured way I had known since childhood. He wrote, "I know this letter will reach you after I'm gone. I don't know how things will be received, but I want you to understand this. I made the decisions I did not to punish anyone, but to protect what mattered. You were there not for the money, not for the name. You showed up because you love, and in the end, that's what I want to survive me, real love, real loyalty." I read it twice, then a third time. Memorizing the curve of his words, there was no apology in it, no rehashing of the years we'd lost. Just a final acknowledgement, a final choosing. He'd seen through the performances, the posturing, the manufactured closeness that vanished the moment his health declined. He had seen who stayed when the lights dimmed and the cameras disappeared. And he gave me the last word. But more than that, he gave himself the last word. Because this wasn't about revenge. Not for him, not for me. It was about clarity, about setting the record straight, in a way no one could rewrite or deny. The will wasn't just a document, it was a mirror. And for once, it reflected the truth. Not the polished version everyone else had been selling, but the raw, imperfect, honest truth of who showed up and who didn't. I folded the letter and tucked it into a small wooden box, the same one I used to hide notes in as a child. It felt right there, like it had always belonged. I still hear them, sometimes, the family, trying to reason it out, spinning stories to anyone who'll listen, claiming manipulation, confusion, error. But I don't respond, I don't correct them. Let them talk, because no matter what they say, the truth has already been written. And the last voice they ever expected to hear, the one they tried so hard to silence, was the one that spoke loudest of a aloud. And through him, mine.